Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the IRDL Speaker Series. This series is coordinated by a working group of librarian researchers who participated in a professional continuing education program called the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. We welcome you today from the William H. Hannon Library at Loyola Marymount University, the home of IRDL. My name is Marie Kennedy. I'm the Serials and Electronic Resources Librarian and the co-director of IRDL. Welcoming you also is Christine Brancolini, co-director of IRDL and Dean of the Library. You've joined us at a good time. Our Hannon Library has just won the 2021 ACRL Excellence in Academic Libraries Award, one of the highest honors a university library can receive at the national level, and it recognizes libraries that significantly impact their students and contribute to the mission of their parent institutions. Won't you join us in the chat box for a little cheer? So this speaker series is designed to shine a spotlight on voices and ideas that challenge traditional ways of conducting research. It surveys various topics, including specific research methods and critiques of processes associated with a Western social science approach, with the intention of inspiring research explicitly rooted in social justice. As librarians, educators, and researchers, we welcome this opportunity to reflect and incorporate what we learn from these speakers into our own research efforts so that our methodologies integrate anti-racist and anti-colonial practices. We look forward to thinking critically about research and power with you at today's session with Emily Ford. So we have two IRDL scholars as your moderators for today, Sophie Rondeau and Nicole Branch. Take it away, Sophie and Nicole.
Welcome. My name is Nicole Branch, and I'm currently serving as the co-interim university librarian at Santa Clara University. Just a few logistics. We are recording this session, and it will be made publicly available on LMU Library's YouTube channel soon. We will be using the live transcription provided by Zoom. You can find that at the bottom of the screen. The Q&A as well as chat have been enabled. Please use the Q&A to direct questions to the speaker and use the chat for commenting and sharing your thoughts with the group. In the spirit of this series addressing issues of power and research, today we are using a progressive stacking approach to the Q&A and will prioritize questions from BIPOC attendees. Please put an asterisk at the front of your question to self-identify. There's also a vote up and down option that we'll be using in tandem with the progressive stacking. We want this to be an uplifting and positive discussion. It's a professional event, and we will not tolerate any disrespectful comments in this session. We reserve the right to remove anyone from today's session if we observe anything that does not honor our speaker or fellow attendees. Our plan for this event is to invite our speaker, Emily Ford, to speak, and then we will have approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers, finishing at the top of the hour. And I'll hand it over to Sophie, who will lead us in a land acknowledgement.
This event has been organized in part through the Loyola Marymount University William H. Hannon Library. And so we use this location to base our land acknowledgement. The land that the William H. Hannon Library sits on is seized territory of the Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tobanga, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. We want to start by recognizing their history and calling attention to their presence. We encourage you to learn more about the history of the land where you sit by going to native-land.ca. And if you are on Tolonghar in particular, we are pasting 2 additional URLs into the chat box for you to explore as you wish. And now Nicole will introduce our speaker.
Great. And Sophie, if you could maybe mute, there's a little bit of feedback. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Emily Ford, our speaker for today. Emily is an associate professor and an urban and public affairs librarian at Portland State University Library in Portland, Oregon. She loves stories. She is curious to understand what makes people tick and how we can connect in community via lived experiences. Although her research is focused on opening scholarly peer review, she views the peer review system as one comprised of human experience stories. Her book, Stories of Opening Peer Review Through Narrative Inquiry, will be published by ACRL Press this summer. When not immersed in stories, she is most likely found trail running, practicing yoga, and putting her petting her cats and pet rat. Emily's talk today is titled From Story to Research, Storing Human Experience Narratives. Please join me in welcoming Emily Ford.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Give me a moment while I share my screen. Because it's Zoom, we all have to figure out how to do this. All right, so you should be seeing my screen now. Just doing a time check, make sure I don't go over. All right. So welcome everybody. I would really like to thank the IRDL Speaker Series for inviting me to be a part of this really inspiring event. To Sophie and Nicole for facilitating, Carol and Marie for keeping things running in the background, John for doing the Zoom live stream with YouTube. And then additional thanks to all of the other unnamed people and institutions that have made this a possibility. And congratulations to the library. I saw that news over email from ACRL. It's incredible. And I also want to acknowledge and thank the people who are listening and watching. You gave me a reason to wear something other than yoga pants today, so thank you. On my shared screen, you can find my contact information. It's also, really easy to find on the web. I'd be really humbled if you checked out my project website as well. So I would like to, before I begin discussing research and stories, I'd like to share with you more about my physical environment and my worldview. Both things have shaped my own lived experience and my own stories. Today, I sit on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Kathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. I acknowledge that I am here today because of the many sacrifices forced upon these peoples and their ancestors. By recognizing these communities, we center our work and honor the first peoples of this region. And the image on the screen is the Columbia River Gorge. It's gorgeous, haha. It's one of my favorite places. I am an able-bodied, neurotypical, white, cisgendered, heterosexual woman. I call myself an atheist Jew. I am an intersectional feminist. I believe that knowledge is never concrete, constantly shifting, and that it cannot be separated from our physical and psychic experiences. Since today I'll be talking about research methods and research methodology, I would be remiss if I did not pay tribute to my dear friend, Bob Schrader. I witnessed and learned from Bob while he was on his path to discovering critical Indigenous research methods and also autoethnography. He supported me all along the way while I was discovering my own approaches. And so thank you, Bob, if you're here today, thank you very much. I'll see you next week for our lunch date over Zoom. I also owe appreciation and gratitude to the many individuals who have shared their stories with me, both formally and informally. Without this generosity from these folks during which they have been open and very vulnerable, I would not be able to work with these methods that I'll be discussing today. So this image signifies where I wish I were with all of you right now. I would love to be chatting with you in community, in nature. Unfortunately, here we are in a pandemic. So thank you for coming. Please use the chat to introduce yourself, make comments, whatever. I would like this to be as community oriented a time as possible. If you do have a specific question, remember the Q&A feature, but please just chat amongst yourselves as you would at a conference. We don't have that, we haven't had that opportunity in quite a while. So I'll be sharing with you some of my influences that have been kind of swirling around in my brain. That a lot of them will be shared in the book that's coming out this summer. And then from there, I'll be sharing with you a little bit more about storying stories, which is a research methodology and methods written about by Coralie McCormack. And my sincere hope is that you are able to take away some of the either background approaches to storying stories of narrative inquiry, or storying stories itself into your own work, or even just have it be an opportunity to think about eliciting stories from other people. So I also need to share with you a little bit more about my disposition. When it comes to research and librarianship, I see research as a very human-focused endeavor. And so is our praxis. As librarians, everything we do is, at least for me, is a practice of radical love. And I'll connect this to bell hooks. Many of you are probably familiar with bell hooks, and her work is, everything she does is undergirded by this concept of love. In Teaching Critical Thinking, she says, quote, "Genuine learning, like love, is always mutual." And in her primer on feminism, Feminism is for Everybody, Hooks tells us there can be no love where there is domination. So if we operate in a realm where the purpose of research is to learn, then we can connect that research to a practice of love, or a practice of radical love. So learning, like love, is always mutual. In love, there is no domination. Research, like learning, also mutual, also an act of love, or a practice of love. So I would like to share with you a little bit. Another one of my influences is Radiolab, the wonderful podcast from WNYC. And one of the co-hosts of Radiolab, Latif Nasser, or frequent guest on Radiolab, Latif Nasser, was speaking with Rachel Cusick a few years ago about stories and why stories. So I'd like to share with you this very brief 1-minute clip that I think kind of captures.
Here's what I tell myself. I tell myself that there are.
That captures, I would just want to turn on the volume. Anyway, here's Latif.
Here's what.
Sorry.
What I tell myself. I tell myself that there are 7.5 billion people on planet Earth. There are 7.5 billion people out there. And if you presume, let's say, that 1% or even 0.1% of them have like fascinating stories happening to them, like dynamic, newsworthy, exciting, dramatic, movie-worthy stories happening to them on any given day or any given week, right? If you presume that 1% of those 7.5 billion people have those stories, like, there is no way all those stories are getting told. There's just no way. Like, there's just not enough journalists in the world to tell all those stories. And those are just the alive people. There are a lot of dead people who have great stories. There are a lot of animals who have great stories, and businesses and consumer goods and planets and inanimate objects and microbes. And like, there's there's actually an infinity of stories all around us.
So thank you, Latif. There's an infinity of stories all around us. An infinity, and every person has a story. So let's talk about narrative inquiry. Narrative inquiry is a type of qualitative research. It's focused on making sense of the human experience through personal stories. So it's phenomenological if you want to use a big academic jargony word. Young-Hee Kim is an educational researcher who tells us in her book, an incredible book, by the way, Understanding Narrative Inquiry, that the purpose of narrative inquiry is to invite readers to a sphere of possible contact with a developing, incomplete, and evolving situation, allowing them to rethink and reevaluate their own views, prejudices, and experiences. To me, that sounds a lot like it's pretty close to learning as a form of love. From a method standpoint, narrative inquiry is, like I said, the study of experience. It can be approached through interviews, photo voice, biography, memoir, autoethnography, oral histories, and many more forms, even through creative forms. I cannot say enough how much I relied on Kim's book when I was engaging with my research. I noticed that there is some chat about references, and my slides have all of the references I mentioned today at the very end. So if you have the link to the slides, the references are there for you as well. The other thing that I'd like to note about narrative inquiry is that it's close to participatory action research. So this is a kind of research discussed in education. Debbie Pusher and D. Jean Clendenin have talked about the intersection between action research and narrative inquiry. And they say, quote, "There is an interrelationship with action research. At least there is if we understand action research as research that results in action or change in the practices of individual researchers, participants, and institutional practices." So that means when people tell and retell their stories, there's opportunity for reflection, evaluation, and a potential action based on that retelling and evaluative experience of even retelling the story. It also, I will note for myself that that has been true in my experience of gathering stories. My own actions have changed based on what I have learned working with participants. And participants have, at least from what I've heard from them, begun to rethink their own experiences and their own actions. And this is partly what I think is so powerful about qualitative research in general, but also about research that can really acknowledge the social context in which research is occurring. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a minute. Research that interrogates power structures, that both in what is being researched, but also in the act of the research itself, or the social context in which research happens, allows for that action and allows for that mutable change. So one of the method that I use for interviewing folks is active interviewing. And this, you'll see the cover on your screen of this book. And this is the method I've used to gather stories. There are many ways to interview, but this approach particularly I like is because it's been defined by these authors as an interpretive practice. Because it really acknowledges the social context in which an interview is occurring at the time it occurs. It positions and acknowledges the interviewer and the interviewee as collaborators together in making meaning. Time, place, experience, all of these contribute to the meanings that are collaboratively made. So like if you're interviewing someone over Zoom, that contributes to the meaning that's made. If you're sitting in a cafe, if you're sitting outside on a park bench, for example. And then I'll also say that this means that meaning can be ephemeral, so that it is of time and place. And what we also see in that is the meaning that you make during an interview, or even in the analysis of a transcript working with a participant as a collaborator, the meaning you make could be different from day to day. So if I have this conversation today, what am I learning? If I were to have this conversation yesterday, or if I were to have it tomorrow, the meaning that we make together is mutable, changeable. So there's not really one concrete, knowable, like E equals MC squared kind of thing, right? That's the nature of qualitative research. So active interviewing can also allow the interviewer and the interviewee to reflect on the power dynamic that's happening at the time that it's happening. So I think that's really important in this particular method. And then the interviewer in active interviewing also doesn't, you're not necessarily stuck to a script. Certainly there's themes you want to talk about with somebody, but you can also bring yourself to the interview. You don't have to be like this automaton, basically. So Holstein and Gubrium say that interviewers, quote, converse with respondents in such a way that alternate considerations are brought into play. So you could question the interviewee. And it allows for a range of complexity of meanings. All right, so this this image, if you went to public school in the United States, and maybe even not in the United States, you learned about this in English class, probably. There's a few things that I kind of want to talk through on this slide, like what is the story? So I'm assuming here that you have this graphic of a very strapping young man, probably of European descent, acting out the events of a storyline, right? How a story works. So the young man hears the distressed call of probably a long-haired, very fair-skinned maiden or princess who needs to be saved from the beast. He saves her, or he can save her. So he runs to save her and he fights the beast, and the beast is slain. They fall in this beautiful heterosexual, heteronormative love, because of course women must fall in love with men who protect and serve and save them, you know. And then the young man is crowned king and they live happily ever after. So I realize I'm being very cheeky, but I do have a point about this. And also, because I do not think in binary, I also really love historical dramas. I love Pride and Prejudice. The story structure is really befitting here. So this Western story structure, Western European story structure of this princess savior narrative. It represents how we understand story and plot lines in a dominant Western culture, dominant Western European based culture. And the methods and approaches that I'm talking about today, they have not fully escaped this frame. So again, it's not a binary. Just because it's based in this Western European frame doesn't mean it's necessarily bad, but I think we do have to be very critical and aware of that particular frame for stories. Okay, so let's move from high school English to sociolinguists. In the late 60s, there were two folks, William Labov and Joshua Waletsky, who came up with this Libovian model of storyline. And there are these 6 elements that you see on your screen. It's a keystone work of sociolinguistics. It's a very, very useful model that has been used quite a lot and built upon in many ways. It's also highly problematic, and I think if taken at face value could be reflecting colonial colonization of stories. So something to be aware of. However, it is useful to look at stories as things that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is this book I was just pointing out to the organizers. If any of you love The Moth, there's this book, one of the Moth folks, long story short, that also is about how to tell stories for the Moth. Really easy read, really fun. But also at The Moth, they tell you a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I would like to move on and talk about how McCormack has enhanced this model to think about stories using both the abstract orientation, complicating action, evaluation, conclusion, and then the coda. But before I do that, I would like to talk a little bit about Donald E. Polkinghorn, who I believe in the late 80s came up with a definition of analyzing narrative, or how to analyze narrative and how to view it. So there's 2 things that Polkinghorn brought to us that McCormack really borrows from. Stories are not told in a linear fashion. Anyone who's interviewed anybody knows this. Anybody who talks around in circles like I do knows this. But as a researcher, you can cut and paste, just like this child is doing on this screen in their preschool class. You can cut and paste a transcript or a narrative and put it into a temporal order. McCormick, in one of their articles, calls this emplotment. So an emplotment of the transcript, or an emplotment of the narrative. And then the second thing that comes from Polkinghorn, which is really powerful in how you understand narrative inquiry, is that there's two types. The two types of like analyzing these narratives. So there's analysis of narrative. And I like to think this as like the grounded theory type approach, where you have an interview or a story that then from that transcript or interview, you're identifying themes. And then from your themes, you have research findings, right? You analyze and you do a lot of contextual work looking at these things. And then you go on to your research findings. Well, McCormick did not use that. McCormick was looking at it more as narrative analysis. Oh, let me go back and say this: in this analysis of narrative is a paradigmatic type. So stories move to elements. That's a good way to think about it. So in the narrative analysis, which is Polkinghorn calls the narrative analytic type, elements move into stories. So you have an interview or a story, and then in that interview or a story or series of interviews, as McCormick did in their work, you take those interviews and you put them into plot lines, and then you can form an additional narrative. And that final narrative that you create from the interview transcripts incorporates your own analysis in collaboration with the interviewee. And that product is called an interpretive story or an interpretive narrative. And I guess the other thing that I'll say about this is that in constructing a new narrative that's enhanced with your analysis, you can bring in those social contexts of power that happened while you were interviewing together. You can bring in all sorts of other nuances that I think get missed in the analysis of narrative type. So when I discovered Coralie McCormack's work and storing stories, it was like Godot had shown up. Or I also liken it to the first time I moved to Oregon. I moved to Oregon when I was 18 to go to college. I had never been here before. And one of the very first things I did was stand by a tree for like 10 minutes in total bewilderment, looking up at this giant tree. I grew up in Oklahoma. Trees there compared to the trees in Oregon are like shrubs. So for me, it was just like, I felt bewildered. I was in awe, and it also felt like I was at home. And that's what finding storing stories was for me. It was like, oh, this is exactly what I've been looking for. I went running into Bob's office. Bob, I found it. Bob. So thank you, Bob, again. So Coralie McCormack is an Australian researcher who developed this method while conducting research for their dissertation, of which was studying female graduate students and their experiences of leisure time. So this work draws on methods from sociolinguistics, feminist theory, educational theory, postmodernism, critical theory, so many different theories. It is truly like this multidisciplinary, multi-layered approach to understanding stories. And the image that I have on the screen is twofold. One, it's trying to show you the complexity of the network of what she has done, what McCormack has done. But then secondly, because this webcast had so many registrants, we didn't get to play Stevie Wonder at the beginning. And so this graphic is actually a genre map from Spotify for funk, and you can actually see Stevie Wonder's name in there. And so that's my shout out to Stevie and Superstition. So the other thing, so with this, what you do with these transcripts is, in addition to reordering them, you also view that you re-listen to the audio a lot. You start listening to how people are saying things, you know, where are they pausing? Where are they laughing? Is their pitch getting higher when they're telling a story? Are they using internal dialogue? Are they using external dialogue? There's a lot that you unpack in this method. So I want to share with you, oh, I love Stevie. I'm so glad other people here love Stevie. So this slide, I don't expect you to be able to read this slide. I do have a publicly available Google Doc, which is linked from the PowerPoint here. And I believe Nicole or Sophie also have it, and they can paste it in chat. I took the 3 main articles that McCormack wrote talking about this method. And in those articles, I had to glean from each one of those articles to put this method into an actual outline that I could follow. So this what is represented on the screen is everything in there is a quote from a piece of an article, but it put me in a position where I could see exactly what I needed to be doing with these transcripts. Particularly being someone who does not have a PhD, who didn't really learn about research methods in graduate school, it was very important for me to have this guiding document and bring it together for myself. So let's see. So yeah, if you can get to that document, that would be awesome, because I can see where there might be questions based on that document that we can talk about in the time that we have for questions. So just quickly, how I see using storying stories as a way to kind of unpack power. Like I said, still there is some method that could be construed or could be used in a colonial way. So it's very important in this method to make sure that you are not using that method as much as possible to colonize the stories that you're trying to gather and share with the world or with yourself. So one of the things that is really important in the storying stories method that I absolutely love is the way that McCormack has articulated how we can reflect on the research process itself. As a researcher, how am I positioned in relation to the participants? How am I positioned during the conversation? How am I responding emotionally and intellectually to the participant? So there's a few things here. Prior to each of the interviews that I did, I started reflecting. Before I even spoke with somebody, I wrote down, how do I know this person? Do I know this person? What is the dynamic with this person? Some of the people I was interviewing I had never met. Some of them I had known of through people. Some of them I went to, maybe I knew them professionally. Maybe I knew them from past lives. So it's really important because that's part of the context. That's part of the story of the interview itself, is how do we know each other and where is that power dynamic? Because that also comes into play into how people share stories. And then these things you can reflect before the interview, during the interview, after the interview, and then as a completely iterative process throughout the whole analysis. So I had a notes or reflection template that I kept with each interviewee, just for myself, but where I kept writing all of these things down. So even if I was listening through transcripts and cleaning them up, I was making notes to myself about, in this instance, Emily, you are, I could tell I'm being challenged intellectually or emotionally, or I'm relating with somebody. So another way is that in this feminist approach, that you return the transcript to the participant, which is, I think, in qualitative research now, hopefully standard practice. But the transcript that you return to the participant is partially storied already. You may have already cut and paste and created stories based on the temporal telling of them. So in an interview, someone will talk about an experience for 5 minutes, and then maybe 30 minutes later, they'll circle back to the experience they talked about at the beginning. You can cut and paste. So I had already done some of that work. I had already started constructing stories and identifying the abstract, orientation, evaluation, complicating actions, etc., the conclusions and the codas. I had already started doing that. And so I was able to kind of reorder and then ask these questions of the participants, does this compare? Like, am I getting it right? I have done cutting and pasting. Is this right? Does it make sense? Is there anything you want to admit? Make any other comments, etc. And that it can be a very robust process. And not every participant, engages very deeply with this, but some of them do. So the final interpretive narrative is really a really cool document. And one of the ways that it can unpack power too is that it distinguishes with formatting different voices. So there's a screenshot here from the copy edit Word document of the book that's coming out in summer. And this is part of Stuart's story. Stuart in the book is sharing their entire interpretive narrative openly with their actual identity. And I'm very grateful to Stuart for being willing to do that. But you'll notice the right justified italicized portion of the text is an intellectual response of mine to something that Stuart said. So this is a reflection that I added to the transcript while after our interview, after I had listened to the audio multiple times. I was working through text. So I wrote it out. And then you'll notice what looks like the kind of typewriter-y looking font, like I think it's Courier, is writing that I did to kind of glue the story together. And then the indented Times New Roman is those are Stuart's words. So being able to just distinguish voice. And then the other thing that this interpretive narrative can do, which is really cool, this is from Bethany's interview. And so you'll notice, in addition to the Courier, and then you'll see something that's right justified but not italicized. That is a response from Bethany after Bethany saw the transcript that had been partially analyzed. And that was Bethany responding to my intellectual response. And you'll notice, I don't know if you can see, but it says, I disagree. And so one of the powerful things about storing stories is that not only can Bethany say to me, I disagree with you, here is why I disagree with you. And then that can become part of this like robust living document and collaboration, where not only did we make meaning at the time of the interview, we made meaning as we were discussing how we interpreted what she had experienced and how I'm taking it in, how she's taking it in. And so I think it can really call to that power that happens, right? Like I don't know of many other methods that bring this in so deeply. And then the other thing with the interpretive narrative is that it does follow that Libovian model. So every interpretive narrative borrows from my reflection template. So this is the orientation to Stuart's story, where it starts out the day that I speak with Stuart. I'm in my home office. I had just moved into a new house. It was July. It was really, really hot outside. Stuart lives in the UK, so there was a big time difference. I'm sipping coffee and Stuart's like, it's in the evening after the workday. But it's you kind of position, like, what is the environment in which this conversation even happening? And I think it can really draw someone into this narrative and like cozy up to learn, like be ready to learn from this story. And then, oh, I think I have to click on this one. Yeah, so the other thing that this pulls out too is that in this orientation, I can also call myself out. So I did notice, particularly in the active listening of all of these transcripts, when I was going through the audio again and again and reading the transcript side by side, I realized I was interrupting Stuart kind of more than I should have been. Stuart takes a lot of time to get their words right, and Stuart was really thoughtful, and I was just so excited to talk with Stuart that I think in that paradigm, like I caught myself interrupting them. And so I'm able to call that out right at the beginning and position the interpretive narrative with that in there and say, like, I'm so excited to learn with this person. I find myself interrupting them. And that's a power dynamic. And so you can call yourself out and say, oh, how did I mess that one up? Which is okay. All right. So now, how is this research? Because, well, obviously this thing is based in theory and applied lenses that unwrap the big questions of what is the human experience like, right? With whatever theme. And I think, people who are really into like quantitative research may look at this and be like, you're cutting up transcripts. You're, what are you doing? You're letting your voice go in there. Oh, and to that point, I should say, like, it is a danger too. We don't want to center ourselves as a researcher into somebody else's story. And there are so many different ways that we could center ourselves, right? Like I shared with you at the beginning, a lot of my personal identities. I could have been centering my whiteness. I could have been centering my cisness, right? So there are many of my own personal lived experiences that I need to try and work as much as I can to not center myself, because it's about learning from other people's stories. Even though my story is intertwined with theirs, that's not the point. So you have to work really hard not to be colonizing them, so being very aware of the story structure, the structure in itself that we're putting it in, this Western European structure is a colonial practice. Like, let's be honest, it is a little bit of a colonial practice. So how can we work with that? It is a colonial practice, yet it is also a norm in academia. Like, I really struggle with this one a lot, actually, with that colonial practice. But how do we work really, really, really hard to decenter ourselves, decenter our own whiteness, our own cisness, our, all of those other things? And it's very, very hard work. Okay, so, and then the other thing that I'll say, like, how is this research? Well, to me, research is about people. Research is about learning, and you have people learning together and with this expression of radical love, and we're creating new knowledge. So that, to me, is research. That's what we're doing. The problem that I see where this comes into play is, great, you have these awesome interpretive narratives, but in our current academic culture, what the heck do you do with this awesome document that's probably 13 or more pages long of an interpretive narrative that you quite possibly can't share with anybody? And that's where it's a whole other talk and a whole other situation where we talk about the culture of academia and the culture of disseminating research and what that looks like and what counts and what doesn't count. So finally, like I said, there's a slide here. I realized I left off that Margot Lightman book, the Moth book, but that's fairly easy to find. And then I will move on to my last slide, which shows questions, and then I will turn it over to Sophie and Nicole so that we can get to the discussion portion of this hour.
Great, thank you so much. And yes, just a reminder, feel free to enter Q&A into the Q&A. We have a few questions that have come in already. The first is, what kinds of research questions are best suited for narrative inquiry?
I love this question. And I realized this morning when I woke up that oh shoot, sorry. I have my stack of influencing books over here for inspiration while I was talking. So this is Kim's book, Understanding Narrative Inquiry. And there is I could find a quote for you. These are not, I would say that the questions for narrative inquiry need to be a little bit broader than we might have been trained to ask, because you're asking about someone's experience or the human experience. You're not asking about, what's a good example of a like really niche research question? You're not asking about, okay, I'm looking at one of my pet rats, Pee-wee. You're not asking about, what is Pee-wee feeling when he moves his tongue like this, right? Like, that seems like a really kind of concrete thing. So an appropriate question is something that's a little bit more like, I want to know the stories about this theme, or I'd like to know the human experience of this. So for example, my research question for my book, Stories of Open, and the project that I'm still working on informally at my website, the question is, what are human experiences of peer review by LIS professionals? This is very broad. It's a very broad question. But in Kim's book, and I can try and find the site later if you want to email me or tweet me or whatever. I'll try to be better at Twitter. I can find that page number for you and pull out the quote. It might also be, I might have also quoted it in that article that's in CNRL. And it's definitely going to be in my book.
Okay, another question. I work with narrative in biomedical research.
Oh, cool.
Well, I don't, the question.
Yeah.
One of my one way of decentering the investigation to involve the subject in the design of the study. I'm not sure how that applies to what you're talking about, but I wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean, so Bethany, who part of where I showed you that Bethany responded and disagreed with me on some of my analysis. Bethany also responded to me about, you know, those 5 questions that McCormick asked that you send the transcript back, the partially analyzed transcript back. Bethany responded and was like, you know, one of these questions is really funny to me because I forget exactly what she said, but she was like, she so astutely pointed out, like, this question doesn't make sense. And by her pointing out that that question didn't make sense as I returned the transcript, showed that she actually understood exactly what I was doing with storing stories. And it was just this incredible moment. But yeah, absolutely. So I would guess, since you're in biomedical research, I would imagine that you're kind of coming from the CBPR lens too, right? Like, where your community that you're doing research with assists in the construction of the research approaches and methods. So yeah, I think it's totally appropriate, you know, depending on your project. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, another question. How do you keep track of the notes, memos, and transcript annotations over time?
Oh my gosh. So every step of the way. So like on that document where it has like 1A, step 2, blah, 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 blah. I would save, I have different versions. So on those questions where you're trying to identify the abstract orientation, evaluation, et cetera, for the story, those I coded with highlighting in different colors. And so I have a document where it's the raw transcript with the highlighting in colors, and I save that. And then you could be using brackets to identify. I mean, so it's so messy. It is so messy, and it's so messy that I don't know. I'm not very well versed in using Atlas. I'm not, and I have used Deduce before, but that's when I was doing work that was based in grounded theory, and so it was not as grounded theory is very nuanced. But I will say that what McCormack says of storing stories is that you're bringing in multiple lenses. So in addition to me reading, it's also listening for the pitch of someone's voice, like I said. So that's where I used comments. So just in Word, the comments, highlighting. I used also formatting. So each day I'd save a new file and with the date. So as I moved on, and I went through the process in a linear fashion, like the outline went. So some of it was a little bit iterative, but I was able to do that. So I can go back to the raw, like the first time I started touching a transcript where I'm just making notes on tone of voice, or I'm making notes about my intellectual response. I hope that is a helpful answer about that.
Okay. And setting aside what academia constitutes as research, how do you balance your duty as a researcher to protect your research subjects, i.e. their privacy, not causing undue emotional stress or trauma, with trying to figure out how to disseminate this kind of research? For example, if your interviewees are members of vulnerable populations, or whose communities have sacred knowledge that may not be meant to be shared as deeply as this method prescribes.
Sure. If the knowledge that you're trying to look at that isn't meant to be shared as deeply as this method prescribes, then maybe this isn't the correct method to be using. is one of the answers I would say. The other thing that I would say, you know, when I say Bethany, that is not Bethany's real name. Bethany is a pseudonym for somebody that I spoke to. The other thing is that that is something that you have to be very aware of. Kim, in Kim's handbook, or not handbook, what does she call it? In Understanding Narrative Inquiry, it's almost like working through the whole thing. It's almost like a textbook. It's great. Work through the whole thing. She talks about it as called caring reflexivity. So caring reflexivity is a concept not coming just from Kim, but from qualitative research in general, about how to approach qualitative research with that love. I think that's part of the radical love, is there are certain things that if you find out as a researcher should not and cannot be shared. And because that would be part of colonialism, right? Like if we were doing that, we don't want to do that. Absolutely. Because it's about people. It's not about like unpacking all of the knowledge that exists in the entire world. That's not what this is about. And then in terms of the emotional stress and trauma, like, again, it depends on what is your research question, right? Maybe there are people who choose not to participate in your study. People, you know, when you go through IRB, you always do that thing with human subjects research where you can end this interview at any time, you can blah, 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 you know, all of that. So that is another way to kind of get about it and make sure that you're still being very, very ethical and aware of those issues.
And imagine that I'm a busy librarian. Can you give me tips on how this method might work in my research life?
Thank you for asking that question. And thank you to the questioner. I was able to do this work on a sabbatical. I have incredible privilege of being an academic librarian with tenure who was able to get a sabbatical, and I have enough privilege that I could afford to live on the salary given to me during that sabbatical. So I'm speaking from a place of enormous privilege. During this method, had I been working my full-time job and doing this, I don't know how I would have done that. The sabbatical, the book is based in 10 interviews. I've since been doing, I'm sitting on 12 or 13 more transcripts that I haven't, which I'm not really analyzing a lot. I'm just kind of putting up on my website just to share people's stories. But one of the things that I do, which may or may not be helpful, but just in terms of my research and writing practice, I have a writing group that I meet with actually over Zoom. We do it 2 hours a week. We turn on Zoom, we say hi, we say, what you working on today, check in, and then 10 minutes before the end of the 2 hours, we pop back on, say hi. And, you know, so I just block it out of my calendar. Again, I have the kind of job where I have the privilege to do that. And tenure has granted me that privilege. There is absolutely no way I would have embarked on this research journey prior to tenure. Just would not have happened, which is really frustrating for a lot of the early career researchers who may be interested in more longitudinal or qualitative research of methods that are this deep. The other thing that I'll say in my writing and research, I use the Pomodoro method, you know, the tomato. So 25 minutes concentrated work, 5-minute break, 25 minutes, 5-minute break, 25 minutes, 5-minute break. And I think after 3 or 4, you get a 15-minute break. So that's also something that I use.
And how would you apply results of narrative analysis, and how would you share your research results? Is anonymizing the participants and getting permission to share anonymously enough to enable you to share full texts of the stories you created?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So so I'm going to bring it back to Bob and Anne-Marie, actually, and Rick Stoddart, who wrote the Self as Subjects book, the autoethnography book that they edited with all of their colleagues who engaged in the autoethnography community of practice. They were looking for how to write an article on autoethnography, and the journal, Bob's chapter in the book, talks about this. were unable to get journal editors to like even see this as a legitimate form of research in LIS. And so they ended up writing a book, or they ended up editing this book and getting other folks on board to investigate this research method, which I think is awesome. So one of the things that I was alluding to at the end of my talk is the culture of academia, particularly in LIS, where Anne-Marie has pointed out in the introduction to that book that without a theory, institutional needs may dictate the way we do our research versus the way we actually want to be doing our research. So that can be a problem, right? We live in a culture, an academic culture of the refereed article. Like the refereed article has the most currency. And I heard this from some people I interviewed as well. So one of the things that I did is Stewart agreed to share their entire interpretive narrative, which I am eternally grateful to Stewart for that. And that'll be in the book. Oh, and I should also mention the book will be published as an open access book at the same time that the print comes out. So it will be online. And then I used pseudonyms for folks. And then in the book, I share no one's entire interpretive narrative is shared in like one section except for Stewart's. But if there were particular points where people were telling stories about something that they felt like really couldn't be shared, I went back to them and I said, I'm sharing this entire chunk. How do you feel about that? So I kept in contact with these folks. And you know, I had someone say like, can we change this? Can we delete this? So really putting the power back to the people who participated.
And this will be our last question. You mentioned decentering. How did you approach decentering yourself from your research and from your research question?
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting because the question actually comes from my own lived experience. So yeah, that's interesting. You have to continue that caring reflexivity that Kim is talking about. And I found that keeping that journal for each participant is really, really, really helpful. And the other thing that you can do there, you know, when you're in conversation with somebody, certainly things are going to come up that aren't germane to their story. So there were certainly portions of the conversation I had with folks that were my contributions to that conversation had nothing to do with our story. So it just got deleted from the transcript. It's not important, right? I don't need to analyze it. It was just a conversation, and that's not their story, and it doesn't necessarily belong in the interpretive narrative.
Thank you so much.
And I hate to do this. Yeah, we're out of time. We still had so many good questions to ask you. Thank you, Emily, and to our moderators, Nicole and Sophie, for their work today. Thank you to Loyola Marymount University for its support of the Institute for Research Design in Librarianship. Thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for your support of IRDL for 6 wonderful years. Thank you to the team that labored to put together this learning event. We look forward to learning alongside you at our next event. Please join us next week on February 12th for the next speaker in the series, Kakali Bhattacharya. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.